Good morning, everyone. I call to order this meeting of the Finance Committee for Wednesday, November 10th. We'll now have a land acknowledgement. Councillor Ma.
We are fortunate and grateful to live vibrantly upon the land of the Treaty 7 people. We acknowledge these are the traditional territories and home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Pagani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yahe Nakota Nations, Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley, and the Métis Nation Region 3. Recognizing that we are at a crossroads, in the spirit of change, we are committed to seeking truth and reconciliation. As we are all treaty people, may our actions be brave, bold, and meaningful in righting past injustices and honor the sanctity of life moving forward.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to approval of the agenda. I noticed in the agenda package it says for November 9th, but it's for November 10th. And are there any changes? I don't know of any. So today what we're going to be doing before we adopt this agenda, just so everybody knows, we'll go through the remaining materials on the operating budget. And then hopefully for the last hour, we'll be dealing with motions from council, making requests of administration as we go for going forward in the budget process. So with that, I will move approval of the agenda for November 10th, 2021 Finance Committee meeting. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. And now we will continue with the operating budget. The saga continued. Ms. Richardson.
Today is not as long a saga as yesterday was, so we only have a half day today.
This is the long-awaited finale, though.
Yes, and I wish it was a very exciting conclusion, but really it's just wrapping up.
And then we'll have capital budget, the sequel.
Maybe your motions will be the exciting conclusion of this morning.
Sorry.
So this first part is the last piece of the operating side, the master fee schedule. It kind of is, again, one of those pieces that doesn't really fit in neatly anywhere, so we've chosen to include it now. And then we'll start to bridge the operating and capital budgets with a conversation around debt and reserves. That's probably me. I'm going to mute that. So we typically provide the master fee schedule at the time of budget approval, partly so that these approved fees are in place for the whole upcoming calendar year, and additionally these proposed fees inform the revenues for the upcoming year. The master fee schedule, for those who this is new for, is a schedule we maintain for the town, which is approved by council and amended usually at the budget time. So lately we've been doing this annually, but when we had 2-year budgets, we did 2 years of fee approvals. And it establishes the required fees to collect for certain activities, everything from fill permits to cemetery fees to subdivision requests, etc. The master fee schedule operates under the principle of cost recovery and user pay. Adjustments are made to the master fee schedule to reflect the cost of providing the service. The user pay principle is that the person or business needing the service pays the fee rather than the general taxes covering the costs of these services. Changes to this year's fee schedule included inflation in supply costs, fuel, and staff time. So depending on when the fee was last updated, it might be 1 or 2 years of COLA if it's staff time. There's also consideration, again, for those specific items. And we try to keep it to even numbers, so we don't update them every year. We try to keep them to, say, $5 increments or dollar increments. Again, so you'll see a range of increases. It's not one consistent percentage or anything that's been applied across the board. So I've provided 2 copies. The first, I do appreciate, is rather small, but it includes the comments. And then a more eye-friendly version that's clean is the next. So you actually have 2 copies of the same fee schedule. It's just kind of easier to see things all in one row, so you can see last year's fee, this year's fee, and any justification for the change. Really, we're just providing this for information at this time, unless anybody has any questions based on a quick perusal. But this will be coming to the council meeting on December 7th for formal approval, so you'll have time to review in more detail between now and then. So next, as mentioned, to start to bridge the operating and capital, we were going to move on to a discussion of debt statistics and reserve balances. And sorry, before I move on, were there any questions on the master fee schedule? I know I just provided it. Okay, perfect. So within the debt management policy, there are certain specified metrics that are reported on annually. So these are some of those critical metrics. And really the debt servicing side affects the operating, and then to the extent that we're using debt to finance, it informs the capital. So that's why we're kind of providing this information at this point, kind of straddling those two sides. So the MGA sets out a debt limit, and the town's debt management policy holds the town of Canmore to a stricter debt limit than that imposed by the province. So the MGA has a specified debt limit for municipalities at 1.5 times the revenue of the municipality, and our debt policy has, again, a stricter requirement at 70% of that. So in this visual representation here that you also have a copy of with what I've handed out this morning, the red line at the top is the MGA limit, and that black line is our internal limit, again at 70% of where that red line is. And then the bars represent the debt taken. The blue is existing and the red will be new. So you can see with the addition of the fire hall in 2023, we do get a bit closer in that year if we're looking at kind of that 3-year operating over the 5 years. There's still kind of a gap there. I believe in 2023, the difference between us and that internal limit is $15 million. So we still have kind of a healthy buffer there for any new things that may come along. And then it's similar on the debt servicing side. So again, this is the amount of the payments related to the debt taken, not the absolute amount of the debt. And again, the MGA specifies this limit as 0.25 times the revenue of the municipality. Again, our debt policy has a more stringent limit at 70% of that. So similar here, the red line's the MGA limit, the black line is our internal limit, and you can see on the debt servicing side, with how kind of low interest rates have been in recent years, we are well below even our internal limit on the debt servicing side. Ms. DeSoto?
Thank you. Can you just clarify that these numbers are inclusive of the utility debt and debt servicing?
Correct.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Any questions on either of those graphs?
Yeah, that question just sparked for me. What about Canmore Community Housing? Their financials are part of our books, right? So do they have plans to take debt, or what works there?
So I believe at the time, some of this predates me, so I can't remember the exact time frame, but at one point we did have an option as to whether we would include CCH's debt within our own for the purposes of calculating against the debt limit. And at that time, the decision was made not to include CCH's debts, other than to the extent we might provide guarantees, things of that nature. Those will be included in ours, but their debt as a whole won't be included in these, and that was a decision that was made, an option that was given to municipalities historically.
Right, and yeah, you're triggering a memory for me. Yes, it's only if we guaranteed it and put the town assets in security for that.
Correct.
That
So
debt, okay.
to the extent that we have guarantees and have liability associated with that, that would be included, but the guarantee wouldn't be the full amount of their debt.
Thank you.
And if I could just clarify that a little bit. So the two long-term debts that CCH holds are for the Hector building in the Palliser area and for MacArthur Place in Three Sisters. And so the Palliser, or the Hector building is town debt, I believe, correct? Yes. So, and it was between that time and the time we built MacArthur Place, when we were investigating all options of whether or not we needed to include CCH's debt into ours. So there is an option through the Municipal Government Act. Even though their financial statements are consolidated with ours, we have the option to include their debt in our debt calculation. And so the debt limit is a function of revenues, a certain percentage of revenues. So in this calculation, we don't include CCH's revenues, for example.
I presume that we don't include CCH's assets then too?
Well, we do for all other purposes in our financial statements except for the debt calculation. And there is a note in our financial statements that clarifies that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
So these first two rows are also kind of the actual numerical values that were represented in the charts we were just looking at. So again, with the proposed budget we're bringing forward, our 2022 use of the debt limit will only be at 49.1%. So again, well below that 70 provision. On the debt servicing side, again, we're at 28.1% with our the budget we're bringing forward for 2022. So again, well under there, the 70% threshold on that side. The other guideline is debt maturing within 10 years should be less than 50%, and we're at 12.7%. So again, well below that other metric.
And it looks like, according to the graphs, that 2022 is either very similar or just below the 2021 debt servicing?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just trying to refresh my memory, going back to the operating side. So we did have, I think I touched on it briefly in that first day of operating highlights, but we had some old debt related to the library that's now Arts Place that has now been retired, so that's why it's gone slightly down, is because of that retirement, and then we see it start to go back in future years as we take on more significant debt.
Thank you.
So then there are two metrics that pertain to the portion of our revenues that we're using to fund those debt servicing costs, and these are our internal guidelines. So the next is the percentage of municipal taxes that are used to fund tax-supported debt servicing costs. So again, how much of our taxes are we using to fund debt that relates to the tax side or the operation side rather than the utility supported side. So this limit is set at 15%, and again, we're well below that at 3.8%. It does go up in 2023 up to 5.1% again when that fire hall debt that is tax supported comes online. From a utility perspective, because we do look at utility debt differently, so any debt needed for our water and wastewater and solid waste services, that should be less than 22% of our utility revenue. So again, we're at 18.4%, so closer on the utility side than the tax-supported side, but still below our policy provision.
Chelsea, oh, sorry, Ms. Richardson.
I respond to both.
We're all learning. Can you explain to me why we've separated out utility versus municipal taxes? Just a little historical on that for me, please.
Well, I don't know if I can speak to the historical side very much, but the idea is that the utilities should be entirely user fee supported. And so the idea is that to the extent that we have debt related to the utilities, that the debt servicing on the utilities is paid through the utility fees rather than taxes, and anything like the fire hall that is tax supported, those fees would come from taxes. So that's why we look at the debt a little bit differently. It's how we're funding the debt servicing is different. On the utility side, we want it to be covered within the fees, and hopefully there'll be a little more clarity on that when Mr. Camo comes to go through the actual utility model. And you'll see in the determination of the fees, we're actually including these debt servicing costs in that big model to tell us what our rates need to be to cover all the expenses related to the utility, including the debt. Whereas on the tax side, that's why we're kind of excluding the utility and looking at it separately.
I can expand on that response. The utility is slightly different because we have taken more intentional debt in the utility due to the ability to collect offsite levies to support the infrastructure in the utility for growth, needed for growth. So whenever there is a growth-related project, we will likely take debt for it because we're going to collect to support that project over time from future development. And so those offsite levies also show up as a revenue line in the utility to help support those debt payments. So that is part of why we differentiated the two, because there's different approaches as to why we would take debt in the utility.
And I'm assuming that the forecasting on that is based on future populations that we've predetermined.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions on these two statistics? So this is primarily for information purposes. There isn't necessarily metrics around this or policy provisions, but the interest rate of our outstanding debt, cumulatively, the blended rate is 3.2%. The interest rate for debt maturing in the next 10 years is slightly higher at 3.6%, and that has to do with some older debt that will be retiring in the next little bit that has historically been at higher rates than we're seeing right now, which is why you see the average interest rate for debt maturing outside of those 10 years is lower at 2.8%. Any questions on any of that? So next, I wanted to speak to the reserve balance targets we have for our operating reserves. So first, for the tax stabilization reserve, which we were looking at the end of the meeting yesterday, the recommended minimum balance is 3% of annual operating expenditures, while the target is 7%. So you may recall that those were those kind of two bands we were looking at in the visual chart. So based on the proposed budgeted expenditures, these are the ranges we would have for the 3 operating plan years. And you can see that we start above the targeted balance, mainly due to the entire allocation of the 2019 surplus, some of the COVID-related grants we received that we put in there. But by the end of 2024, we are back within that range. Next is the general operating reserve, which has a recommended minimum balance at 5% of annual operating expenditures and the target balance at 10%. With the budgeted expenditures, we are below this range for all 3 years. There are no budgeted planned contributions. We haven't talked about this reserve much yet, but it's primarily for working capital purposes to provide funding for any unanticipated operating expenditures, basically in the course of us providing our services, or any unforeseen kind of emergency expenditures. So next, I'm going to go through some of the specific reserves. And first, I wanted to note, again, it doesn't matter so much the specific reserves. I think as Ms. DeSoto alluded to in one of our previous meetings, it really is kind of a giant funding puzzle on the capital funding side of which reserve we might use for different things. It is mostly fungible, especially on these capital side. Again, some of the developer money is more restricted, but these first few we'll be talking about, we have flexibility with. So I'm going to go through them one by one. Again, we're kind of at that bridging point. So the additions is really what ties to the operating we've been speaking about over the last couple days, but the capital funding is kind of the piece that's yet to come. So more detail to come on what specifically we're funding from these reserves, but really I wanted to look at the overall picture for these reserves. So first I have the general capital reserve. So the top row is the beginning projected balance each year. So we're starting 2022 with a projected balance of $5.6 million. The next is our additions. So these are those transfers to the reserve from the operating budget as we've been speaking to. Then we have a couple adjustments. These are stemming from some land transactions that were directed to be contributed to this reserve. You'll also see the PAH reserve has, or Vital Homes now I should say, reserve has some of that as well. Then there is the capital funding line of what we'll be spending from this reserve. And again, we'll get to that in a couple weeks. So in total, as you can see, we are contributing $2.6 million, if you look to the total column on the right, to that reserve over the 5-year span, but we are drawing $3.3 million for identified capital projects. So over this period, we are drawing more than we're contributing from our regular contributions from operating, and there's nothing that we're really contributing that would be set aside to meet future identified needs outside of this 5-year window.
Thank you. So the adjustments, those are the paybacks from funds borrowed to support Vital Home additions at what was called Mountain Haven and now is Wolf Willow.
Correct.
Yeah,
So you'll
okay.
see as those units are sold and will be repaid, a portion of that goes to the Vital Homes Reserve. And then because we borrowed from our own general capital reserve for that, at that time it was directed that a portion of the proceeds basically make our general capital reserve whole.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Just a clarification on that, the 587 is actually the proceeds from the sale of the right-of-way at Railway Court, the previous council decision. The timing of the funding coming into the town was tied to, I think, registration of subdivision, and we expect that to be in 2022.
Correct. So that's the 587, and then the $1 million in 2023 is the formerly Mountain Haven amount. So So next is the photo radar reserve. So we're starting 2022 with a projected balance of $409,000. Then each year, based on the revised revenues and the subsequent transfers expected, we would be contributing $312,000 each year. Then the adjustments are for the operating uses to fund the equivalent amount of 1.5 RCMP officers and community safety and education initiatives. And you can see those adjustments for the next 3 years are increasing in accordance with the expected wage increases. And then we have 2 capital funding uses, again, which we'll talk to further when we get to capital. So you'll see we're slightly overdrawing by the end of 2024. We could have tidied this up a little bit so that we wouldn't be in that overdrawn position, but really those reserve transfers will depend on how much we get in photo radar revenue and ultimately how much flows to the reserve. Really what we wanted to highlight here is by the end of 2024, we will be using up that entire beginning balance that we had. And then going forward, our projected additions are only kind of close to those operating uses, that adjustments for the equivalent of the RCMP officers and the safety initiatives on the operating side, and there isn't really anything left for any capital projects related to safety initiatives. Next, we have the Art Trust. So we're starting with a balance of $289,000. Then there is $103,000 each year based on those new policy calculations. Then there are the operating uses, and again, capital funding uses. So over the 5 years, we're contributing $515,000. We're utilizing $145,000 for those operating purposes, and then there's $185,000 that's scheduled for capital uses.
Lisa, was it Pete? No, some number from Van. Probably the mayor of Van.
But I see Dr. Cottle's coming to my rescue.
I'm just going to add to that. Thanks, thanks for that. The only thing that's missing that's not projected yet around the Art Trust is one of the elements of the Art Trust is a grant. And we just haven't had the staff time to create the grant program and develop what that will look like. So we expect that there will be additional draws on this trust, but first the grant program needs to be developed, it will be brought to council, and then we'll begin it. So likely in 2023, we'll see some additional draws to this trust. It just isn't fully developed yet.
Thanks for that. Were there any further questions on the Art Trust or the grant portion or anything? So then we have the Economic Development Reserve. So we are beginning 2022 with a projected balance of $616,000. And as was referenced in the presentation yesterday, with the addition of that business registry position to be funded through the business registry revenue, we don't have any further future budgeted additions to the reserve going forward based on the budget we have now. So the only proposed draw is one for $75,000 in 2023. Again, we'll be walking through those project specifics when we get to those capital days. So other than that draw, the reserve balance essentially remains unchanged as it stands right now over that 5-year window. Then there's the asset replacement.
Sorry. Oh. And maybe this is a question for Dr. Cottle. Is there a proposal to review the fees charged for business licenses at all, just given sort of the economic development desires within the town to be able to do future capital or future initiatives?
Yeah, so part of what's on the books in 2022 is a review of our both what the fees are and the number and type of fees that we have. So simplifying our offerings, but also looking at the appropriateness of the fees. And again, as I mentioned yesterday, the operating budget is very conservative in assuming revenue based on current trends. So we actually expect that there will be additional contributions, and then there may be an increase to a fee down the road as well. But that work will take place in 2022, that review work.
Okay, thank you.
There's nothing else on economic development. Next I have the asset, I always get the order wrong, replacement and rehab reserve. Anyway, I'm just calling it asset replacement. We're starting with a projected balance going into 2022 of $10.5 million. Then we have transfers from operating. Again, some of that comes from the franchise fees and other transfers for a total of $14.9 million over the 5 years. We have capital funding for identified projects of $16.2 million over that time frame. So again, similar to the general capital reserve, by the end of the 5-year plan, we will have less in the reserve than we started and will not have anything new saved for future rehab or replacement of our existing assets. And just a little bit of context, I know even for myself when I joined the town, I know that $10 million sounds like a lot of money, but I just want to put some context around that. And again, we haven't talked much about the capital side yet, but in the work we've been doing around asset management, when we've been looking at the replacement value, so it will be different than what you see in the statements, but when we look at an estimated replacement value for all of our town assets, we're looking at a value into the billions with a B, not the millions. So again, just a bit of context that 10 million is a big number, but in the scale of the assets that we are looking at rehabbing and replacing, it isn't that large in the scale of that. So just a bit of context that I found helpful. So then there's the flood mitigation maintenance reserve. So going into 2022, we will have a projected $786,000 in the reserve. Then there are the transfers in, again, from operating. The long-term financial strategy recommends an increase of $25,000 each year. We weren't able to manage that increase from 22 to 23, but we have included it from 23 to 24. There are no draws from this reserve, as the intent is to build up the reserve to fund the work required to maintain any flood mitigation structures, particularly after an event. So this is kind of we're building it up over time and only needing it in the event that that maintenance is required, particularly after a flood event. So that's why you're not seeing any draws against this particular one. Then we have the relatively new sustainability reserve that was created, I believe, just in the last budget process. So as this is a new reserve, we are starting with a balance of only $89,000, but with the contributions from franchise fees, we are contributing an estimated $878,000 over these 5 years. And the only proposed draw at this point is for $45,000 for projects in 2022. So ending the 5-year time frame with a balance of $922,000. Ms. Smithers?
Yeah, sorry, Chelsea, just for some context on that, because as Ms. Richardson mentioned, it is a new reserve. The intent really is to use this as kind of an incubator funding source for new projects that we want to pilot related to climate action and sustainability, and then push out to operations across the town. So that's where there's one draw on it now, but the intent is over the years, as we identify new opportunities or requirements related to climate action or sustainability, we would draw from this fund to do that kind of project development and implementation work. So just a bit of context on that.
Councillor Graham?
Do we receive any interest on this money? Yes.
So all of our reserves are, you'll hear the phrase, kind of cash backed. So to the extent that there are kind of longer term reserves used over time, we do have a significant diversified investment portfolio. And so for all of our reserves, as they're earning interest, it is all allocated back to the reserves. So the additions here are the contributions that we're making, but there is also interest that flows through to these reserves as well. Again, at the end of the year, when we look at the performance of our investments, that all gets allocated out. So that isn't captured in these additions, correct, Mr. Irwin?
Microphone?
So only general capital and the...
Just asset rehab and general capital on these ones, because the other ones are small amounts. Just for clarification, any interest the town makes does not go to general revenue at all. Well, in the financial statements it does, but it doesn't offset taxes at all. Everything flows to the reserves because they're cashback reserves. You know? So taxes shouldn't fluctuate because of gain or loss in interest. So.
Do we know the average return on those investments over the last while?
That is a great question. It hasn't been great lately. Obviously, we're paying less on the debt side, but we're also getting less on our investments. But generally, that's market conditions overall. comparatively, I think our investments are doing well. I don't have percentages off the top of my head, though. I think we budget about $1 million a year. We do budget the money coming in and then flowing through to these reserves, so there is about $1 million in interest income in a year, if that helps, but I can actually look up the specifics.
Just maybe a follow-up, and I'll cut to the chase on this one. Is our debt servicing outperforming our investments on the return of this capital? Do we make or lose money having these reserves versus our debt?
I guess I'm struggling to kind of think of what the alternative would.
If we were to have no reserves and pay down our debt, would that be a net positive or a net negative for the corporation?
That's something we could report back on,
Yeah.
maybe do some calculations. I'm just thinking, we have restrictions on the type of portfolio we can take in investments in, and we have to stay very conservative. We can't invest in more risky funds, and that's restrictions set by the province. And there are reasons we want to take debt. There's this whole who should pay for an asset. So when you're building an asset that has a 50-year lifespan, like a new recreation facility or whatever, should you drain your bank account now, which has been funded by the current taxpayer, or should you have that asset be paid for over time by future taxpayers? So we've had that discussion at council a couple of times in the past. And it is a bit of a balancing act.
Sure.
But I think we can maybe provide some additional figures on that so that you can create that own balancing for yourselves and then how you might want to move forward with that.
Thank you.
Right. The other thing is the flexibility, I guess. So in addition to the equity principles Ms. DeSoto was just speaking to, so we do generally try to match the term of the debt to the life of the asset. So we're not paying it off as quickly as we possibly could. We are trying to, again, so for something like the new fire hall, we're trying to match that debt term to the life of the fire hall, again, for kind of that equity principle that over the years that our residents would be benefiting from that new fire hall, they would also be paying for that debt servicing over that same window. And in addition to that, the reserves give us a certain amount of flexibility that, again, if we used a lot of our reserves to pay down our debt, that we wouldn't have. So for things like
COVID,
floods,
explosions, we would have never been able to recover from any of the, I'm not joking, we would never been able to address any of those issues if we hadn't have had reserves, period.
No, I fully recognize the fact that
So
cash and cash flow and cash reserves are necessary. I'm curious as to what's outperforming which.
Yeah, and there's some balancing there that we can definitely look at some
And
numbers.
there's asset replacement timelines, and I recognize all of that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I just had a comment. Sorry.
Councilor McCallum?
Thank you. So usually once per term, we have the investment portfolio person from Wood Gundy come to speak to council. And I don't think it happened this term because of COVID, but maybe it's something we can plan in the next term.
For sure. So,
This term.
I kind of came mid-term here, so I wasn't sure if that had
Yeah.
happened before my time. But that is something that I believe Ms. Rogers might have even included in her presentation, is that we do plan with the new Council/Finance Committee to have our investment advisor come and give an update about our portfolio and how our investments are performing, what we're
Yeah.
invested in.
I think even personally, from an investment perspective, I'm struggling in the last 18 months to align that with what I've known for the last 20 years in terms of how I've invested. I would struggle to answer that question based on the fact that I think my high interest to savings account's giving me all of 1.5%. So it's, which is pretty good right now. So I think it'll be an interesting question to have administration report on. It's just, I would have a hard time, like, based on now or based on 18 months ago. Because who knows what these markets are going to look like.
What's our total amount in reserves right now? Is it about, based on this, is it about 20 million?
Mr. Irwin, do you have the exact number there? I've just got it by reserve here, but I know there is a total on this sheet. including utilities, 42.
42 million in reserve? Oh, okay.
Any further questions on any of this? Councillor Faubert?
One quick one, thank you, Ms. Richardson. Is there a target amount for the asset rehabilitation replacement reserve?
No, and that is a great question. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. There is. If you look to our reserve policy, I believe there's some language in there for both the general capital and the asset rehab reserve that basically says that their target value is sufficient to fund the work that we need to do. So there is, but it's not a hard dollar value in the same way that those two operating ones, the tax stabilization and the general operating have, which is where these conversations, there isn't necessarily a firm target, which is why generally I wanted to speak to the fact that over time we're starting to use more than we're contributing. That's a trend we can manage for a while, but likely not in the longer term. Some of these, a lot of the way that we were able to kind of weather the storm of COVID and get down to that 0% tax increase, and some of those things were through reductions to our reserves over the last number of years that we haven't been contributing what our long-term financial strategy would suggest, or that we had been contributing historically. They're big dollar values, so that's often one of the first places we end up looking when we need for reserves, but now we start to see some of the consequences of that and the risk associated.
So I just wanted to actually clarify, what is our total reserves not including utilities? $33? Okay.
33? Yeah, I'll say it with Mike for anyone.
Chelsea, just maybe a high-level overview of asset management and the work that we're doing on that side and how that connects. I think it might help with Councillor Faubert's question. We will spend more time on that on the capital discussion, but it might be a good...
Sure. So I'll try to give the super quick snapshot summary of that, and then I did plan to include a bit more of a detailed discussion again once we get to capital. But as it pertains to this conversation, Councillor Faubert, I think you mentioned this at one of the previous meetings, that tracking tangible capital assets is relatively new in the landscape of municipal finance. And then even more recently than that, so the tangible capital assets, for anyone who might be a little bit less familiar, is basically kind of us tracking all the assets we have, recognizing amortization annually. But it's really focused on the historical value of those assets. It's looking kind of backwards, and it's a good proxy for, again, we kind of look at the amount of annual amortization to see, are we roughly contributing that going forward? But it is historical focused, not necessarily replacement value focused and forward looking. And so that's where really in recent years, I think through the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, and especially here in Alberta, there's been more of a push to, yes, we absolutely have to do the TCA, that's a requirement, but also recognizing that asset management and kind of that forward-looking perspective and planning for the future infrastructure and capital needs of our communities is also very critically important. So we've had an asset management coordinator. It actually resides within our finance team, but is obviously incredibly heavily supported by Ms. Smithers' group, since most of the infrastructure is in the municipal infrastructure division. But we help provide tools and financial analysis to help support those managers in the work that they do. And so we're still kind of working through the early information gathering stages. Obviously, there's a huge amount to do there. So kind of we've developed an asset registry, again, using some of the tangible capital asset information that we've had historically, but also kind of looking at it from a different level of granularity, comparing it to what we have in our GIS systems to create a really comprehensive asset registry of all of the assets the town has, to the extent we can find information when they were purchased, and rather than focus on those historical values, looking at, okay, what would a replacement cost be for the end of the lifespan? What does the maintenance look like over the life cycle of these assets? And so the long-term financial strategy that was adopted a number of years ago was kind of an early look at that, looking at all the master plans we have. What do those all indicate that we need in terms of capital identified needs, and how does that match against the funding that we've kind of been historically looking at against the grant landscape? And at that point, there was a copy of it provided in your binders if you've happened to have a chance to take a look at that. But it did identify a pretty significant shortfall in those projections between what the recommended contributions and what we could afford could be and what those identified needs were. Obviously, in the intervening time period, I have looked at how that tracks against our approved capital budget since that time. We've actually spent slightly more than what we'd identified at that time. And obviously, with the uncertainty around some of our grant programs, again, we'll come back to this more, but MSI, we've had $2 million reductions compared to what we used to get through that program. And we've also had the challenges of COVID and other challenging budget years when we've also reduced our contributions. So this isn't a unique challenge to us. I think that's why there's this emphasis on asset management across the province and this discussion of infrastructure deficit, because we are all kind of in the same boat. At the end of the year, when Mr. Scott, who you saw yesterday, and his team come to present, they do talk about our financial health and indicators. They do indicate that for all the metrics that they look at, which includes some of the reserves would factor into some of that, that we are in a healthy position compared to comparative municipalities in the data set they look at. So comparatively, we're sitting okay, but it is definitely a challenge we're all facing. So I don't know if that covers some of the asset management.
I just wanted to point out as well that this approach to asset management is also another great example of business transformation and really getting more formalized in how we are tracking our assets, projecting what we're going to need to maintain those assets, coming up with more efficient ways for our teams to record that asset information. Super intense on a workload side, but critically important to our future. So, yeah.
Any other questions? I've kind of drifted away from what's on here right now, so I'm happy to address any questions on asset management or our capital reserves generally. I do still have a few more specific ones to go through as well, so either way. Perfect.
Okay, Councillor Graham.
Yeah, Councillor Graham.
Can you talk a little bit to how we depreciate assets over time, just for my knowledge and the people at home?
So for basically all of our major asset classes, we have, and I think it's right in our financial statements and one of the note disclosures, we have kind of groupings of the assets and the useful life. So there's kind of starting benchmarks that we use based on kind of the asset classification that it is, that we use to say, well, this generally lasts 20 years, this generally lasts 5 years. But there is also a lot of discussion between finance and the applicable departments for an asset-specific basis to say, well, does this meet those kind of criteria, or for this specific thing, should we be looking at a different useful life? So there's general kind of classifications and 5 to 10 years or 10 to 15 years, and you'll see those in our financial statements. But we actually have kind of more specific information that we use on an asset-by-asset basis. Again, there's a lot of internal collaboration that goes into that. But generally, there is a useful life that we determine for that asset based on how long it will provide service to our community, and that's what we use to determine those useful lives, and it's just kind of a straight line over that time period with some adjustments for the year that it's purchased.
Please proceed.
Perfect. So I had just touched on the sustainability reserve, and the one other new-ish one we have is actually our paid parking reserve. So at this point, we don't yet have a projected opening balance. It will depend on we're mostly kind of in the cost side for the rest of the year. Most of our revenues have probably come in, but that's why there will be an opening balance. We just don't have a projection yet because this is our first year of the program. But again, we do have a projected $335,000 going in 2022. Again, that aligns with the presentation Ms. Rogers did briefly at the start of hers about our overall paid parking expectations around revenues and expenditures, and this is kind of the net result of that. Again, as a reminder, this is after that transfer to transit has occurred for the fare portion of the fare-free transit. So again, over the 5 years, we're contributing a total of about $1.7 million. Right now, the only identified capital funding from this again, outside of the transit that's happened before we get here, is $100,000 proposed for the capital project for the implementation of the rest of it downtown. So we are planning to use the revenues that we've received already to pay for the rest of the expansion. So still some uncertainty as to how these numbers will actually play out, which is one of the reasons we hadn't necessarily identified more funding yet. So last but not least of the ones I was going to talk about this morning, we have the Vital Homes Reserve. So we would be going into 2022 with a projected opening balance of $1.4 million. Then over these 5 years, we have not budgeted to further additions. And sorry, we covered this briefly in my opening high-level overview last week. I probably should have referenced this more specifically when we were talking about our partners yesterday. But again, previously we had taxed specifically for this contribution to the Vital Homes Reserve, and we are proposing to remove it for 2022 and onwards as CCH has continued to build its own internal reserves, and the intent was for them to start to work towards more self-sufficiency. So that's why we don't see any future additions in those years. Again, as we're speaking to sorry, Wolf Willow, is that the new name? But the old Mountain Haven, that is the other side of it, is as those units are sold, our Vital Homes Reserve will be replenished. That's anticipated in 2023. And then to the extent that there was a portion of that came from our general capital, a small part of it was going back to refund general capital, and the rest of it will be going into the Vital Homes. So that's why we're seeing it as an adjustment rather than necessarily an addition.
So we're not going to be taxing the levy starting this coming year?
Correct.
How much were we collecting?
250.
250?
Correct.
So that's about a 1% decrease. Has that been taken into account in calculating the 5%?
Correct. That was one of the changes that we made to get within the direction of the 5% overall.
Okay. Thank you.
So even without the additions, that adjustment will increase the balance so that we will end the 5-year period with $3.5 million in that Vital Homes Reserve.
And I believe everybody's aware, but just for clarity, taxes will still support the operation of CCH to the tune of $450,000 a year. So it's just the additional component that was funding this reserve that has been reduced.
Okay, thank you.
Great clarification.
That's why I was confused, because I wasn't making the differentiation between.
Right.
Yeah.
We used to collect about $700,000 per year. We're dropping that down to just the requisition from CCH to $450,000.
Right. And of course, there will be some interest on that, but that's details, right? Okay.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So there are other reserves, including for the utilities, and again, those were they're another big balance, but I'm going to leave those till when we get to the utilities day. And then there are some other ones, including the offsite levy, the recreation levy, and some of our cash in lieu reserves, and those are more restricted, not necessarily funded from the operating side, and so I'm going to kind of park those for now because they're kind of less related to what we've been discussing up till this point, and we can discuss them when we get to capital because they don't necessarily form part of that bridge. They are more restricted. They come generally from developers rather than our internal contributions. So that was where I was going to leave off with the remaining operating items I had for discussion this morning. And unless there's any further questions on anything we went through.
I don't see any.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Perfect.
A cliffhanger ending. Stay tuned for more about reserves and utilities and capital. All right. Do we need a quick break before we get into the motions? Let's quick break. Can we get back for 9:30? That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, everyone, we're back. All right, we are back. Okay, so the rest of our time this morning is to evaluate some motions. There's, I think, 7 or 8 of them that we'll be talking about. And this is where democracy can get messy, because we don't know where they're coming from, we don't know where they're going, and really we're just trying to give some direction to administration as we work our way through this budget process. And for some of us, it's been a while since we've been in the budget process. For some of us, they haven't been in the budget process, and others, this is old hat, just did it last year. So we're all going to be coming from different places of understanding, and so we have to have patience with one another as well. I did want to say a couple of things before we get started, and that's just understanding that we are the Finance Committee. And Ms. Smithers has referred to the sandbox. And so if we think of council's overall role as within the sandbox, just one corner of that has been given to the Finance Committee, and we can't go out of those bounds, okay? And we've only been given certain authority within those bounds. And we will find some greater clarity as we deal with each particular question. So do be prepared that if something comes up that I feel is outside of those bounds, I may rule a motion out of order, but I also may make a suggestion of how what is being put forward can be moved forward in another way, maybe today, maybe at another time, all right? So with that, I will kick things off because I have a few motions, and then I'll move to others that I know have motions as well. So I'd ask Ms. Dinaj to put up my first motion. It's a little bit of a longer one. And what I'm really going with here is I have this sense that most of the increase is related to things such as COLA, increases that are beyond our control, increases pursuant to council policy, and increases associated with fire rescue expenditures. So I just want to test that because that's going to help me in my evaluation of the budget going forward. So what I'm asking here is that the administration provide the Finance Committee a list of all expenditure increases within the proposed 2022 operating budget, so just the 2022, that are over $10,000, so I'm not talking about little fluctuations, that are funded by mill rate and do not fall into one of these categories. So it has to meet all of those conditions. And then those are the 4 things I just mentioned. So really, I'm looking for anything that's over $10,000 that's funded by taxes and is not one of those increases. I suspect it's going to be a very small list. And that's really going to be informative to me. So I'm going to make that motion in hopes that that information will be informative to us, as well as we go through talking to residents about potential tax increases. It will help us be able to explain and for them to understand where the bulk of the increases come from. So, motion's on the table. Is there any discussions? And I would also, unlike a council meeting, if the CAO has any comments about the motion, because you are a member of this committee, please do so. Yes.
Just a clarifying question, if I may, Mayor Krausert. When you refer to COLA increases, are you referring to the salary?
Yes.
COLA? Okay, because that
call
would
it
be helpful,
something?
because there are other inflationary or CPI adjustments to other pricing.
What's the proper terminology?
Cost of living is how we
I'll put re-salary?
We refer that to our pay policy, and COLA is part of our employee pay policy. So that just helps clarify that.
There we go.
Yeah.
COLA salary increases, that's a friendly amendment. I'll take that.
So if I could give you an example, and you could tell me whether this would fall into one of your categories. So there are inflationary increases to costs of power and gasoline, for example, in our fleet.
Out of our control.
That would fall into increases out of our control.
Yeah, out of town's control. So,
Okay.
increases required by law or contract, i.e. out of the town's control. If you would like some more specific language,
But that's
the
okay.
cost of goods. We
That's
can't
the cost
control-
of goods.
We can't control that,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Maybe we can put it there, increases required by law or contract or inflation on the cost of goods.
Yeah, just a question thinking,
Yep.
so in my shop about streets and roads, or even in facilities, they'll have year-over-year increases related to inflation, but then they'll also have, and this is particular, I guess, to streets and roads and parks, growth increases because we have more kilometers of pathway. Streets and roads has X kilometers more of roads they have to plow, so that'll show up in,
Let's put after, no, not there. Let's put it after the brackets of number 3, or growth related.
okay, thank you.
Any discussion, any other discussion, comments? Does it make sense? Seeing none, I call a question. There's a question, just under the bar.
Question.
Oh,
Do
okay.
you want us to speak to our vote?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Because you know I can talk.
You're on. You're on.
So, Mayor Krausert, I'd be happy to support this motion. This is, in my mind, actually, and I was looking through it through the budget, similar to the, we used to get a 2-pager
That's
that
where-
would show the ins and outs of the budget, like status quo, and this, in my opinion, is asking,
That's where it
the
came-
picture.
that's where it came from.
Yeah. So, and I've always found that really very helpful. Ms. DeSoto is smiling at me. I don't know if she's mocking me or just smiling at. This is reflective of that work. I think it's really visually a helpful tool, and I'd be happy to support this.
Thanks. Any other comments or speaking to the motion? Just on that, and I know that we've received this in various places throughout the presentations. It'll be helpful for me to have it all brought together in this realm. So that's why I put it together that way. Seeing no further discussion, I call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Okay. I'm going to go with Councillor Graham. You were the first motion I was aware of otherwise, so why don't your motion get put up there? And go ahead and speak to your motion.
I feel very nervous about this, but we'll be okay. You can do it. Yeah, I'm not sure that I know how to do this, but we'll take a shot at it. I'm motioning that the Finance Committee direct the administration to review the current photo radar program and return to a future meeting of council no later. I want this dealt with within the budgetary process. Through the Finance Committee to report on the following. Options on how this contract program might transition to one undertaken by the town of Canmore. I'll even take out the bylaw services just within the town of Canmore. The safety implications of such a transition and the budgetary impacts of that transition.
Okay, just before you go on further, I'm inclined to call this one out of order, but I think that there is something that could be done today. Because I know you want to deal with photo radar and want to have it reviewed. The ultimate decision is that of councils, right? And the contract is actually not something we can change in the budget because we're tied into it, right? So that will be something for the council to take a look at. But what I'm thinking is that you could have a direction that directing administration to provide options with respect to renewing the photo radar or alternatives within the town of Canmore, and to be come back, present this to council prior to any RFP needs to be issued, something like that. Does that meet your need?
Yes, I believe so. I think reading into the numbers, looking at paid parking and the revenues generated by Photo Radar, I suspect there may be a significant budgetary implication in 2022. This contract is up in 2022, and how does that impact us? I understand that we are in a contract until then. And I hear you about whether the timing of this is appropriate now or in the near future, and I am unsure, to be honest with you.
Well, Dr. Cotto, you had a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear what you're asking for here, and Ms. DeSoto and I had a quick chat about this morning. The reality of letter A in your motion, we don't have the resources to do that by the time council approves the budget. The work that you've outlined here, the safety implications, the budget impact, how it might transition to one undertaken by the town, is a significant workload. We do have a previous report when this was looked at previously that we could bring to council, but the work that would be required to update that to current numbers is not, we would need a resource to do that or significant time. There's other workload that we're planning to do that someone then would not do in order to do the work that you're asking for. Or we need to hire a contractor and get a budget from council to do that work. So what we could do for a future finance committee meeting is bring the work that was previously done and then try to work to understand what would be needed to help move forward with what you're trying to achieve here. The contract isn't up until August, so we do have some time in 2022 to look at the work and then make it, so it would be something that we could bring to council potentially outside of the budget cycle through that process of that when that contract is up.
And
Does that make sense?
That's what I'm thinking makes most sense, because then there's the opportunity for, I imagine it's the supervisor of bylaw services or the director or manager of protective services, one of the two, will bring a report to council with the recommendation around photo radar and any alternatives. At which point we can have a full conversation about it, and if there's a motion that you would like to put forward to go a different direction, we'd have all the information then.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I was unaware that it was in August. I thought it was earlier in the term, and thus. Yeah, thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Soto?
I'm not sure, Councillor Graham, were you going to put forward a revised wording, or did you want me to try to
help me?
Help you? Okay, I was just based on what we just heard from admin. Is it that the Finance Committee direct administration to share details of past photo radar reviews in order to provide further information on how to proceed, or if to proceed with an RFP on photo radar in the new year? But that kind of detail would need a direction from the Finance Committee to Council at a future meeting, right? Once the Finance Committee looks at those details of those photo radar reviews, you may want to, as a Finance Committee, ask Council to give direction to administration regarding that future contract, which,
Are you suggesting that we could give that direction based on the past report?
Well, I'm thinking it'll give you information to help you decide if you need more detail. My inference here is that Councillor Graham is looking at how to deliver photo radar differently, right?
That would be correct.
Right? And so I think we have some of that information. It would be 5 or 6 years old, maybe. Can't remember.
I think it was 2 renewals ago, so that would be about 6 years.
So I don't know.
Was there a process that administration was already looking to go through in terms of bringing something to council prior to issuing an RFP when that contract is up?
I don't know that we had thought that far in advance.
Yeah, because like, I feel like this motion presupposes a decision of council that we're going to change direction, whereas I think what I would like is more information on all options
Yeah.
in terms of that program into the future, including Councillor Graham's preferred.
That's why I was suggesting you provide options with respect to the current photo program, renewing the current program or alternatives, and return to a future council meeting prior to issuing an RFP. Because I think that then gives us the full scope of things. And I think that's where we're going to end up anyway. Councillor McCallum?
Is this actually a budget conversation? Like, I know it has budget implications, direct budget implications, or not, like whether it's delivered one way or another. I feel like this is something we should be talking at strat planning in January.
Yep.
And that should come out within, like, if it's the will, want, and wish of council to review how photo radar is delivered, or if it's delivered at all, I don't think that that's a budget discussion. I think that's an operations discussion, and that's something that is something within the business model of the bylaw services to implement.
Fair enough. That's why I ruled the first motion, or the original motion, out of order.
Right.
And so you're suggesting that,
I don't even think that this is something that's at Finance Committee. I think it's as a council discussion, and I think it's with regards to the business center that is bylaw. Is this how we want this business center delivered, and do we want it even delivered at all? Like, because I know your stance on photo radar, Councillor Graham, so I know that it seems like this is the spot in which to insert it, but I think this is more operations than a Finance Committee discussion.
my thought was it is in the current budget, and so there is some relevance. And it is going, I would like it to come back to council as well, because we're having a contract renewed. We should take a look at it.
Absolutely, and I guess I was under the assumption that we knew that back here, I knew that it was up in 2022, and so I assumed, knowing what you had campaigned on, that this would be something that would come up as part of strategic planning, that's something that we would want administration to investigate within our strat planning term.
Okay.
But that's my view of it.
So, Councillor Graham, this is what I'd like to put to you as your options, or others that you may think of. You could either make that first motion, that the top couple lines, or some version of the second motion and dropping the rest, or let it go and just we'll deal with it in strat planning. Which way would you like to proceed?
I think I would like that information earlier. I appreciate Mrs. McCallum's, Councilor McCallum's.
Councillor McCallum.
This side of the fence, that side of the fence.
And I'm not married.
I appreciate that this may or may not be, in fact, a budgetary, it does have budgetary implications, quite obviously. This is a program, but further information on this program and how we may proceed, and if we want to talk about that in future meetings,
Okay,
that's
so
fine with me.
just the top two lines is what you would like to put on the table as a motion?
Thank you.
All right, that motion is on the table. We've had some discussion. Is there any other discussion on the motion? Okay. Councillor McCallum?
So when is the expectation to share details, Finance Committee, direct admin to share details of past photo radar reviews in order to provide further information on how to proceed with an RFP in 2022. So when, this is just, it comes back whenever? You're not expecting this in terms of, in time for budget approval?
No, I don't think we're going to
Okay.
get this. in time
Mr.
for
Soto?
budget
Sally found it, and it was 2018 review.
Oh.
And so it was in your last term at council. And so we can share that by the end of the day.
All right.
Thank you.
So there we go.
Okay.
All right. And then we can go from there at another time. So there's this.
So then
motion
I
on the
just
table.
want to confirm, so then we'll get this, and then that's it? And then
Yeah,
we can maybe discuss it at strat planning, is that?
Strat planning,
Okay,
or
all right, I
somebody
just want to
or
understand what
If
the.
somebody brings forward a motion at another time, we'll have to deal with that.
Thank you.
Is
Councillor
the,
Faubert?
Thank you, Your Worship. Through the chair. Is the photo radar review confidential, or was it publicly presented? It's confident. Okay, so do we really need a motion for you guys to give us something confidential by the end of the day?
The motion's on the table.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I'd interested to see what Mrs. Sosa says.
No, theoretically, you don't need the motion, but the action is coming about through this discussion,
Yep.
so it doesn't hurt to have the motion.
There we go. Any other discussion on the motion? Councillor Hillstead?
Just curious if the motion should just end at, to provide further information. Just, I'm not sure if we need or how to proceed with the RFP, because that again kind of ties into the whole strat planning thing. That would be a discussion at strat planning if we want to proceed with that. So to me, it's more, the motion is just, let's get the information, just to have it so that
Then I turn,
that,
would you accept that as a friendly motion, or otherwise the alternative is Councillor Hillstead, if he really wants to stick with that, is he can make an amendment motion.
It's deep sand we're in over here.
Well, this is good. This is
motion.
about all of us getting used to working together in the process.
I would appreciate that friendly motion. Thank you.
Okay, so there we go. Friendly amendment. Any further discussion? Then I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Okay.
Let's get a little smoother than that.
Councillor Ma, you have a motion you wanted to put on the table?
Again, like I'm a bit of a rookie here, obviously, so I'm not exactly sure if this is the right time and spot to do this. And I'm probably feeling some of the similar emotions that Councillor Graham was feeling a moment ago. So Finance Committee, I would like the Finance Committee to advise administration to explore the budgetary costs of a text-based community alert system. So this is the sort of thing where recently, well, back in 2013, we had a flood, and this last summer, we had some pretty interesting situations with the water filtration, and we had a situation with the fire at Denman's Flats, and with climate change being a declared emergency, and it just seems that the frequency of these environmental situations is only going to heighten. And I've heard from the community that there's a bit of confusion over what's the central message and how we respond to this stuff. There's been a lot of social media as people falling back onto that. And also, Dr. Cottle highlighted that, for example, wildfire is a big critical thing coming up. And in the spring of 2022, I believe there's a wildfire drill of some sort. And so I think this could be a timely sort of system to also put in to start driving this idea. I've done a little bit of research on this stuff. It doesn't seem exorbitantly expensive. One quote that I did see was about $25,000 annually. So on a per capita basis, it's less than, it's like $1.25 per person to have year-long support for whatever situation we might need for getting emergency messaging out to our community.
So, Councillor Ma, if I could just interrupt there. The process around the budget is we do have strat planning in the first quarter of the year that helps sets priorities. Then the administration is tasked with pulling together a budget based on those priorities. It gets vetted through the departments, comes back to us eventually this time of year, and we start looking at that. So the Finance Committee then looks at those budgetary considerations, but it has to operate within the parameters that were provided to administration. And so if we were talking about adding something back in that was part of that, but is noted by administration as unfunded, then we could be talking about that, bringing it in. But this has never been discussed. This has never been vetted at all. And even if it's a good idea, it's not the appropriate time right now. So I'm going to rule that the motion is out of order. But I am going to let you know, and there's nothing that can save it today in my mind.
Sure.
But I am going to let you know. But I am going to let you know.
I'll take the hit. I'm learning. Like, I'll be vulnerable.
There's three paths forward in the coming months.
Okay.
The strat planning to bring it up. Okay. If council decides to go with it, then there will be some work done by administration to cost it out and work towards evaluating the system. If council does not want to take it forward, but you're still wanting to champion that, then you can bring it to the Agenda Review Committee. And if the Agenda Review Committee decides to bring it on as a notice of motion, or as a motion that you would provide then information about, then it could get onto the agenda that way. If the Agenda Review Committee said, no, we already talked about this at Stratton, we're not going to do this, I'm not saying that's going to happen, then you could bring a notice of motion and you would do the research and bring it on. And so those are different paths forward for you that could happen in the next few months. But if we do this motion today and it gets defeated, you can't come back with it for at least 6 months within the Finance Committee. I don't know if that carries over to Council as well. So, I mean, you block yourself, I think, if we do it today. So, do you understand that? And does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does anybody have anything to add with what I just said? Mr. Soto, does that make, is it accurate what I just said?
Yes, the whole process outline is accurate. I'm not sure if actually the communications team has looked into this at all in the past, so, okay. So this would be a net new program, and I would agree that there are lots of considerations that would need to be factored in before we would, it might be a user pay type system, I think, is how you were describing it, but we don't know that yet.
So thank you for bringing it forward. It sounds like it could be an important thing for us to have a discussion about, but not today.
Sure.
And so we'll just, we'll move on from there, but thank you for bringing it forward.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Councillor Faubert.
It's the rookie squad.
That's right.
All right. I'll note one change, is a Vital Homes Reserve at the end, please. Okay. So my rationale for this motion: direct administration to include $132,000 in the 2022 operating budget in the planning department for a full-time, one-year policy planner position, and fund that new expense by reducing the transfer to reserves from paid parking revenues by $66,000 and transferring $66,000 from the Vital Homes Reserve. Now, the reasoning behind the way I've structured this motion is that the position, the policy planner position, would deal with two issues: the downtown ARP and Palliser ARP. I think that the paid parking revenues are an excellent source to fund the downtown ARP. And I think that when it comes to the Palliser lands, which is a giant, massive bank of lands for future affordable housing, especially Vital Homes, we can use the Vital Homes Reserve to fund that, therefore not increasing taxes overall and getting these two important projects done. I also have listened to administration in the past when it comes to funding regular operational positions from one-time funding sources. And so that's why I'm suggesting that the position be 1 year only, because the Vital Homes Reserve would not be an appropriate place to fund a position into the future on an annual basis. So and I didn't know if in the budget, the planning department had proposed that policy planner position as contract or as being in 23, 24, the future. So I kind of have crafted a solution to getting a couple things done this year.
So before Ms. Smithers provides a comment, I'm going to add to the question that you can comment upon, Ms. Smithers, and that is the nature of the position that was foreseen there. Is it a year contracted? Also, those two ARPs that they would work on, is this the cost associated with them, or are there additional costs that would need to be in order to do those ARPs?
You're stealing my thunder. So there's a few things to this. First of all, the position was anticipated to be a permanent full-time position, not a term contract, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is we simply couldn't do both of these ARPs and have them complete in a year. They both, because they're in established areas, they're going to require community engagement, they're going to require some investigation into engineering impacts, things like that. So I don't anticipate that either of them would, well, potentially could do one complete in a year, but I'm not even sure. It depends on what we would hear back as part of the community engagement, right? So I don't have enough confidence in that to say a one-year term position would work. Another challenge that we would have, and Ms. Rogers referenced this a bit yesterday, is securing professional positions on limited term contracts is really challenging. And we're experiencing that actually right now in planning, trying to find a term position. Very low uptake because it's an expensive community to live in, and a lot of times our salaries aren't competitive with what people can make in bigger adjacent municipalities. So I'm not sure that we'd have much success in finding somebody to work on a one-year term position. And then a third point in terms of the position rationale being full-time. You'll see when we get to the capital budget that we are recommending those 2 projects be done in 2022. We also have a third policy plan in that 5-year budget for the Larch area, just recognizing the amount of redevelopment that we're seeing there and the type of redevelopment that's happening. So we do have longer term, long-range policy needs that this position would need to be addressed. And as I mentioned yesterday, that position would need to be supported by the mill rate or tax-funded budget, just because we should be using application revenues to process applications. And then on the capital side, the other piece that Mayor Crowser referred to is that you will see when we get to the capital discussions that both the downtown ARP and the Palliser ASP are additional unfunded capital projects. So getting that work done is more than just the operating budget unfunded piece.
Is there an amount on that unfunded, or it's just?
On the capital projects, I believe it was 240 for the 2 of them. Oh, yeah, it would be
Rick is amazing.
160,000 for the downtown ARP, and then 100,000 for Palliser.
So $200,000?
260
Oh,
together
260.
for the
Okay,
2 policy
great.
projects. Yeah.
Thank you. So based on that information, would you like to go forward with your motion?
Well, it's just because the information presented to us in terms of unfunded for that position, full-time policy planner position, I just feel like.
Yeah. One thing that I'm going to suggest, first of all, excellently crafted and thought out motion, because you're dealing with something that is obviously immediate, and you've not only want to add it, but you want the funding in. I'm actually very interested in exploring how we can get this done as well. I'm wondering if you withdraw it now, and when we go further through the budget process, perhaps it would be able to come back then in some form.
Yeah, and I would be willing, I think, to consider removing or funding the position and funding the downtown ARP, if we had to choose one thing
And
to
so
do.
perhaps we need more information before we can deal with that. Typically with the budget, as you've seen, but it's different when you're on this side of the table, is that this type of thing would be probably right near the end of the budget process once we've had all the information, and then we have a really good sense of where we're at with the percentages, and then we'll see if it flies, right?
I would really like to find money in the budget to support our planning department. If we plan now, we're going to we have a better future.
Yeah.
If we put off planning, there's nothing we can do about it.
I agree with you.
So
So
I
are
withdraw
you
my
willing
motion.
to withdraw the? Yeah, okay. I think that was a yes. You're withdrawing. Okay. So. Yeah. Councillor Ma. Yes.
From one rookie to another, I just want to say I really admire the motion that was put forth and the creative thinking on how to fund the position. I do firmly believe and agree with you that we have some serious planning that we need to get done. But the various things that Ms. Smitter's advised, such as Larch, Palliser areas, the aforementioned areas that you described as well, and I would also be motivated moving forward, finding a way to fund that position. So, thank you.
And I don't disagree with any of those remarks, and so thank you for bringing that forward. And this leaves us able to bring it back later. Yes, Mr. Soto.
If I could just comment, and Mayor Crowser, you raised this and sort of asked, is there any information that the Finance Committee needs from administration in order to address this in your future debates? So if it does need to be tax supported, that would infer a tax increase unless you reduce other programs or services or costs, right? So do you need any further information from administration in order to kind of do, I know your original motion, Mayor Krausert, might help to illuminate some of those other costs that are in the budget?
Yeah, I'm thinking right now, there will be other information. I've got a couple more motions that would bring some, perhaps some clarity there, but really it's as simple as we either have to be happy to increase the budget and increase the percentage of increase of taxes, or reduce something somewhere else.
Yeah, so just saying, if there is information that you would need in order to decide where to reduce, now's the time to ask it.
Yeah. Councillor Mah?
I thought there was stuff where we were exploring prior that assessing how various fees are charged for the planning department to see if that would also help facilitate the funding of positions. Was that still something that can be done in a timely fashion, Ms. Smitters, or is that a bit of a bigger process?
That's a big one.
Timely is subjective.
Sure. Can we pay for it?
Yes, our intention is to have it done in a timely manner. That being said, it is a lot of work to do it well and do it robust enough to be able to have defensible fees put forward. I'm concerned about looking at kind of arbitrary increases based on a gut feel that we can't really defend, because we need to be fair to our partners in industry, right? So yes, timely. No, timely is not done in 2022.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councillor McCallum?
So through the chair to Ms. Smithers, is it expected that you'd have it in time for the next budget, for 2022 budget? Sorry, yeah, 2023 budget, that's right.
I can't say that with any certainty.
Okay,
at this
all
point.
right.
Sorry.
All right, no worries.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on, and thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to put a motion on the table. My second one, oh boy, you're fast. So here, this is dealing with our franchise fees, right? I would like to understand better where we sit against others, our comparables and our competitors. And I also want to know, I know that 260,000 plus or minus is a 1% increase in taxes, but I don't know how much more revenue in a single percentage increase in franchise fees are. So this motion is that administration provide the Finance Committee with a comparison of Canmore's utility franchise fee percentages against neighboring and competitor Alberta municipalities that are used by the town with respect to the annual property tax comparison. So it's basically what we do with the property tax policy when we're assessing our property taxes, use those same comparators, and then in addition advise of the additional revenue from each utility franchise fee for a 1% increase. And that could probably be worded clearer now that I've read it out loud. But I think you get my point. I just want to see if in fact we are charging less than our competitors, and or if we're charging more to get a better understanding of that particular revenue source. Do I have any discussion? Ms. DeSoto.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Krausert. Couple of points on this. The competitor towns we can't do because BC doesn't have the same franchise fee.
Are all competitors BC?
No, but those would be our comparator.
That's why I put Alberta municipalities.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the other piece, well, we can certainly provide this, and it will help to look at the 3-year plan of operating, for example, or funding for capital, is that our deadline for increasing franchise fees for 2022 has passed. So the franchises, we need to give them notice by beginning of November, end of October, I think it is. And there's mandatory advertising periods, et cetera. Okay. And we did just increase them last year, so we do have some of that information that we provided to council last year at budget time that we can share, and certainly provide some update. But that would allow us to take a look at future years of the plan.
The only thing that changes is it's obviously not going to be pertinent to this. I would still like this information, but it doesn't need to be provided by the 24th. So that
We could certainly, similar to Councillor Graham's motion, provide the report we provided last year to council that had all of that detail. It might be a year old, but it would, and we can update that.
okay. Does it have all the comparators with,
Yep,
with those
it did.
ones?
Yep.
Oh, then fantastic. I'll withdraw that if you just forward that information.
We can do that.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Councillor Ma, I believe you had another motion?
Maybe it's out of order again. I'm trying.
I can tell you A is a lot of work and it's not going to fly, so, right now. But
Right, okay. Well,
but B is very interesting.
yeah. But basically, like during our presentation so far we received, it was flagged that, hey, Main Street closure will go unfunded for this coming 2022. And speaking with businesses and the community itself, it seems like there's a lot of interest to try that experiment for one more year. I feel hopefully by this coming season, the restrictions will be reduced and we can actually realize a full potential of what our pedestrian downtown could be like for Main Street closure. And so I put forth the motion to a report that outlines potential economic, social, and future planning benefits towards closing Main Street for 2022. And Mayor Crouser said that's probably not going to happen. And then B, outline what is covered within the $50,000 budget for street closure, and are there potential ways we could reduce this cost and still maintain a compelling visitor experience?
Yeah. Councillor McCallum?
Thank you for this amendment. My question about letter B, more coffee, please. Would you consider a friendly amendment that would not necessarily be about reducing the cost, but cost-sharing opportunities?
Absolutely.
Can I add that as a friendly amendment?
Yeah. It has already been received.
Perfect. I was kind of looking
Yeah.
clerk
I'm-
law, clerk law.
I'm wanting to actually split these two motions.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I have to talk about another one?
Yeah. No, and so basically, it'll be two motions. Dr. Cottle, would you like to speak to?
Well, I just want to commend Councillor Ma on B. It's awesome and fairly easy to do,
Yeah.
and we're happy to do it. We can do that for a future Finance Committee meeting without any problem. So no problem. A is a bit more ambitious and complicated, especially with timing, but Ms. Smithers and I were just talking, when we have the capital presentation, and we both alluded to it a bit yesterday, the ARP for the downtown, some of this may be part of that. So it fits more in that larger capital project, but it may be too ambitious for 2022. So the 50,000 is really meant as a bridge. If we're going to go forward with the ARP and look at a more permanent approach to a Main Street closure, the 50,000 is just meant to get us through one more summer while that work is done. So it doesn't mean that A isn't possible. It's just more that the one is about operating in the bridge, B, and A is about that bigger project and defining what that capital project would be if council were to choose to fund that. Yeah. So just wanted to provide that for context, but B is very doable.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Let's deal with the first motion first. I think that they're both related to budget, and it's something that's on our plate. It's not a new project like before. It's not out of order. So the first one is that Finance Committee requests administration to put forth a report that outlines the potential economic, social, and future planning benefits towards closing Main Street for 2022. So is there discussion on that motion? Councillor Graham?
I think this is a worthy task. I'm just concerned about the timing of it, if Ms. Cottle is correct, Dr. Cottle. I'm going to get people's things sorted here real soon, I'm sure of it. Should we just push this out a little bit further, and does that at all solve our dilemmas here?
Push which part out?
Timing issue?
Councillor McCallum?
So letter A, jeepers. Okay, time. Reiterating what Dr. Cottle just said, this really feeds into that ARP piece. When we look at the terms of reference for this ARP in the future, we use, planning is set in ARP versus just a plan, because then there's statutory requirements in it. And that's what landowners in the downtown core, as well as business owners in the downtown core, are looking for, is that statutory. They want the teeth. But I think that the closure of Main Street is really going to feed into the overall plan of the ARP. And I think that we already understand the economic, social, and the benefits of it. We just need to insert that in a plan. We've all heard from the community that, this is, we brought European patio culture to downtown Canmore because of a pandemic, which people always thought would never be able to happen, which is really cool. However, but I don't think that it has a space in this finance committee budget discussion. The second piece does, and I'll speak to that afterwards, but I would not be able to support item A just because I think it's actually part of a larger planning discussion that should fall out of strategic planning.
Councillor Hillstad?
I was just going to echo Councillor McCallum's words there. I feel this is more strat plan type initiative and just getting into the further details of the ARP and things. So, so for the first motion, I wouldn't be able to support that one either with how it is currently.
My take on the first motion is very similar to Councillor McCallum, except I don't think that we absolutely fully understand it. I do think we have to go through that ARP process and get further community feedback. We have a lot of feedback, anecdotal and through town businesses, etc. I do think it is entirely within that ARP process, and so I will not be supporting this motion. Any further discussion? Call the question on the first motion. All those in favor? All those opposed?
Welcome!
You know what?
Legacy history later.
You know what? I've been there and done that, and that,
Totally.
that's, I just want to commend, the open mind. That's exactly what you should be doing. You should be listening to what's said, and if it changes your mind, let it change your mind. Even if everybody giggles, I've had those giggles because I've changed my mind too. So anyway, so thank you for that. So now moving to the second motion, that the Finance Committee direct administration to outline what is covered within the $50K budget for street closure, as well as highlight potential ways to share costs and still maintain a compelling visitor experience.
I didn't want, actually, in my friendly amendment, I wasn't negating the need to look at reducing costs. I just was wanting to look at not just reducing costs, but also sharing costs. So that's the only thing I wanted to clarify before we vote on this motion.
Okay.
And I'll be supporting it.
Okay, reduce or share costs?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
All the options.
Yeah. I'll also be supporting this motion. I think that it's good information to have because, quite frankly, if we're going to bridge this year, we're going to have to do it on anecdotal and overall budget sense and basically work with the information that we've got, right? So, Councillor Faubert?
I also will support this motion. I think getting more information will help us make a better decision about how to proceed with this next year. And I think that once we get into capital and we can start talking about the downtown ARP as both an operational and a capital expense, that all three of those things tie in together for the future of our downtown. And we need to go through a process that involves the community, not just business owners and property owners. And that's really an important part of the work we have to do.
Sure. Councillor Mera?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just wondered if I would be able to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Of Councillor McCallum. When you said share costs, who are you particularly thinking? Anyone in particular? No? Okay.
It could be tapping into reserve. It could be asking for business owners to tap in more. It
maybe
Yeah, just curious. Yeah, if you had something specific in mind. Yeah.
I just, I don't think that, Where's, like, I need a mic. I don't think that necessarily reducing costs is might not be the answer. There might be a cost-sharing opportunity.
Yep.
Who knows, right?
And I just had one other for admin. Because our original closure was due to COVID and safety measures, I just wondered, because we're still sort of in COVID, if we have any funds or potential there to draw if we're still in, hopefully not, in COVID-related times, if that would be something we could tap into if there is funds.
The funding we had from the province, based on the motion that council made last year, ends at the end of 2021, but certainly council or finance committee could direct administration to fund that from tax stabilization. That's where we kind of flowed our provincial funding to. And we had started out by funding our COVID initiatives from tax stabilization. When we got the influx of money from the province, we replenished that tax stabilization fund. So the COVID funds that we have end at the end of 21, we didn't put any of that into the budget for next year, but you could use tax stabilization to fund it.
So,
Okay.
So, yeah.
so that would be a subsequent thing, because we're not looking at the funding of it here, we're just looking at the particulars.
Yes.
But it's a good question.
Yeah. So I will be supporting this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Graham?
I too would happily support this, but I'd also like to know what options might be for an increased budget. Lots of people talked about the beautification of downtown, and you know, we did some wonderful things, putting the horse downtown, putting some flowers, but I wonder if we spent $25,000 more, what options might be brought to the table?
So once we know what is covered, then that's something that you can consider, and if you'd like to bring an idea forward of something additional and how it might be funded, that would be sort of the next step once we have this information. Dr. Cotter?
Just for context, originally when we were doing the behind-the-scenes work on preparing this budget, this amount was actually 80,000. And then we reduced it to 50. So what we'll do when we bring this motion forward is outline what the 80,000 would have covered and then what the 50,000 covers. And that'll give you a sense of, yeah.
That's great.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
Councillor Hillstead?
I will also support this motion, just getting more information, especially what Dr. Cottle just advised.
Your grandpa, is that what you just said? He's the only one. Is he alive?
Well, we all call you that too.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, just getting that extra information, the 50 and then the 80,000 that was just mentioned. Just it'll be useful to determine if we do proceed to fund this unfunded item.
Thanks. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Excellent. And does I have one more. Does any other councillor have a motion?
I have one thing. I can go after you.
Okay, all right. We'll go with my third one then, or now it's my second one. Here I'm just looking to see what administration says. That administration advised finance committee of the items that would be recommended to be unfunded from the proposed 2022 operating budget if $260,000 had to be cut, and advised of the consequences of such. So I'm looking at if there had to be a closer shave, what falls off next, and to have a line description of if you do this, this is the consequence. I think it speaks for itself. I'm interested to hear what councillors have to say. Councillor McCallum.
I'm wondering if you would consider a friendly amendment that would not only ask administration to advise what they would cut if $260,000 had to be removed from the budget, but what they would add if $260,000 was added to the budget.
I like it.
Thank you.
So let's see, the administration advised. Okay, would How about be changed? Be changed with respect to the proposed? No, would be, that would be recommended to be changed within the proposed 2020 operating budget if 260 had to be added or cut, and advise of the consequences of such. Okay. I accept that friendly amendment.
I can speak to it if you like.
Please do.
So, we always speak about cut, 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 and if you recollect, during the hearings, we heard a lot from the community that they want to see these things added, and these things added, and these things added, and yet there's a cost to all of those things. And we want a certain kind of community, and if we want that certain kind of community, we should pay for it. And so I would like to understand what an extra percentage would look like, as much as you would like to see what a reduced percentage would look like.
Actually, since I've accepted the friendly amendment, I'd like to see both.
Yes. So again, I guess I'm just following that line, and we did hear from some people during the hearings that you tax me more. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's what we should do, but it would be interesting to see what administration feels is the greatest needs within our community, within our budget, should we ask for an extra percentage. You know, when council's asked, like, what do you see, what would you like for the increase to be within that envelope, honest to God, I feel like we just sort of pluck a number out of the air and throw it down on the table, and we hope to God growth is great, because it will reduce and mitigate that number. And we have been living off growth for as long as I've been elected, if not longer. So I just would like to see what that number looks like and what would be included.
Thank you. Councillor Ma?
I think this is a great idea, put forth both by Mayor Krausert and the amendment from Councillor McCallum. I wonder for languaging, if it would help the public to flesh it out where 260,000 is actually 1% change in taxes. Because I think sometimes when people are like, well, what's 1%? It's actually 260,000. Whereas sometimes I think just seeing the number 260K, they're like, I don't know what that means to my tax bill. So just a little bit of a more contextual piece.
I'll accept that friendly amendment with representing approximately 1% tax change. Okay. Thank you. Any other discussion? Councillor Hillstad.
I will support this motion, just as I think it's a good motion, just to find out, you know, what happens either way. I'm not, with the wording, just the had to, I just kind of want to change that, but it really doesn't matter. It's just,
how about were to?
Was just, yeah, what were to, or, yeah, or
yeah.
Was, or whatever. Just had to, just, before it made sense, but then with the changes, it just sounds a little funny now to me. But that is
very good.
Beside
I'll accept that friendly amendment. Any other discussion? Councillor Graham?
Just a comment, doing the math on the previous 10 years of tax increases, we've, outside of 2020, which we did a 1.6% tax increase, we've averaged a 5% tax increase almost every year. Should we continue on that trend, our budget in 2032, so 10 years from now, would be $45 million. I respect what Councillor McCallum is saying about adding to taxes and always cutting, but just some context.
You know, I don't think that's an entirely accurate context, though, because over that period of time, there's inflation and there's a different value for money. And so if you go back 20 years, 40 years, the cost of living was very much relative also to the different salaries that were raised, and it's actually increased multiple times, exponentially, I should say. So I don't think saying that, you know, just simply 20 times 5 is 100 and it's doubled. You're right in a mathematical sense, but the context is totally different. We would have to have greater analysis to what that would be.
I appreciate inflation and that context as well, just saying.
Councillor McCallum?
And I appreciate that comment. It's not the first time I've heard it. I also would remind you that we've brought on $178 million worth of assets that we have to maintain that were all asked for by the community, who are the taxpayers. And in addition to that, as we have continued to raise taxes, we've continued to lay in the middle of the pack of the entire province, as well as our comparators and competitors moving forward. So although we are raising taxes, all of our neighbors are doing the exact same thing because everything keeps being downloaded onto us. So that's just my rebuttal.
Councillor Mara?
Thank you. I thank Mayor Krausert and Councillor McCallum for her friendly amendment and motions. I'm just curious, where at the end where it says, and advise of consequences of such, would that include, as our CAO Lisa DeSoto mentioned, the cost of future, whatever the project may be, or the position, or whatever comes of this, for the added amount? Will it include I'm trying to think of what you know what I'm saying.
The downstream effect?
The downstream effect, thank you. Will that be included in that?
So that's a great question. Those downstream effects are often unseen when it's a capital project, and this is operating costs. So, I mean, certainly if we're talking about adding, for example, a new position, like the new planner position, that might be one of those priority pieces to be added. That would be an every year moving forward, right? So we could certainly point that out. They likely wouldn't be one-time things. They would be continuing ongoing. But we'll point out what's continuing and what's perhaps just a one-time addition.
And just for clarity, when I'm saying advising of the consequences as such, I'm not talking a report on each line. I'm talking about a bullet point or two on each line. So this is just, if this happens, we won't be able to do X. If this happens, well, it's an ongoing cost and we'll have to keep paying for it, whatever, that sort of thing. Okay. Any other discussion? Thanks for that question, Councillor Mara. Any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. And Councillor Faubert, did you have another motion?
I prepared another motion similar to my first one with respect to the Rome transit increases, but I didn't send it because I thought I would just try one motion at a time. Then, given what happened and given Jeff's motion, Councillor Ma's motion, I was wondering, I wanted to put forward a motion to direct administration to return with more detail around the two unfunded Rome transit increases that's the 138 and the 50,000. I guess I'm just looking for more information. What's the rationale behind the increases? I was reading my transit agenda, and the only transit route in all of Rome's portfolio that hasn't recovered is Camera Local. So I'm wondering if we need to be thinking about doing something for that service in terms of this unfunded additional frequency to help it recover from what COVID did to it. So I feel like more information.
And does that capture your motion up on the screen? Yeah.
Similar to the downtown closure, just kind of looking for more information around what the rationale behind those increases. I already have an idea of how I want to fund it.
Yep. Ms. Smithers?
Yes, so yesterday I spoke to the new service for weekday, being the larger of the two, to increase to 35-minute service between those peak periods of, I can't remember off the top of my head, 10 and 5:30, say, which requires a second bus from their existing fleet to be brought into service. So that cost is related to the driver on that route, right? Because it's doubling that service during that route, well, doubling the resource required for that route. And then the weekend service is the 50,000, and that was the Sunday service between 10 and 6:30, I think it was, increasing to the 35-minute frequency to match the 35-minute frequency on the regional route. So I'm not sure, when you're looking for additional information, what would you be looking for? I can get it,
Okay.
I'm just not sure what else you'd be looking for.
So the only reason to increase the local to 35 is to match the regional on weekends?
On Sunday, yes. It's,
On a
well, it's
Sunday?
all, the goal of it all is increasing ridership, right?
Yeah.
So I think if you look at continuity of service, so you're commuting from Banff to your home in Three Sisters, right? The regional service, if that's bumped up to 35 minutes and then you get dropped off from Route 3 and then you're waiting for Route 5 longer than expected because we don't have the 35-minute service to match that regional, it could influence your choice to not take transit and instead use a private vehicle. So it's really that seamless kind of point-to-point service that we're looking at delivering on the weekend, increasing the Sunday.
Yeah, so there's not, so what I'm hearing is there's not a lot of information that hasn't already been given as a rationale for this to be increased.
The business case for both of those services would pretty much mirror what I communicated yesterday, right? It's the desire to increase that service.
Is that in our package?
It isn't, but I can provide those
Okay,
two
so
business
that's
cases.
what's being
Sure.
asked for. So
Okay.
it's that rationale behind it. I would support this motion because I think that's very helpful, and I have it on my list as something that I'm interested in funding, and I'm sure we've thought of the same funding mechanism. So,
And the other thing too is I think that your previous motion, Mayor Krauser, around that list of what a $260,000 cut and the friendly amendment add, that would also give me more information.
Yep.
So I would want that before I would put forward the motion to add this in and fund it.
Yeah, that's
So,
smart.
All right.
That's smart, thank you. Any further discussion on this motion? Councilor McCallum.
I'd be happy to support this motion. Mayor Krauser, you and I were on the council that approved local transit here in Canmore, and our vision was always to have it fare-free, not only from an affordability perspective, which we know, a household that has the ability to remove an extra vehicle from their fleet will save between $8,000 and $10,000 a year in cost and depreciation, but also, more importantly, to drive our climate goals, our climate mitigation goals. So Rome has, and then there's the congestion. You're correct. This is the one of the routes that has not recovered. Sorry, I'm stumbling. Not recovered as the rest, in part because the Canmore local service has been a service for locals. Locals first, tours second. That's sort of how it has been rolled out in our community. And in Banff, their routes are more tourist-driven, with locals being secondary. And so they also have a large amount of their budget that's funded through their partner programs, so their hotels underpin quite a bit of the cost of that service as well. So all of those things being said, it is something I would like to see the frequency, because of course, if it's more frequent, it's more convenient. If it's more convenient, people will drive it, take it rather. They can consider leaving their car at home. They can consider, climate action, bringing that piece in-house in terms of their own personal choices. But more importantly, it really, through the pandemic, and I can speak to this as a vice chair, that we really made a cognizant choice for transit to be about the few and not the many during the pandemic, because we knew that this was the transportation system that was moving our essential workers around the community, who mostly are not of high income. So that being said, all of those things, I'll be happy to support this motion.
I appreciate the rhythmic dance there, interpretive dance. Any other discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Are there any other motions to be made other than the very last one? Seeing Councillor Faubert, are you doing something or no? Oh. Then I'll make the motion to adjourn. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you.